Hi class, this is the second recording on Aristotle. Today we're going to discuss the two major arguments we still need to talk about, the function argument and the doctrine of the mean. Before I do that, let me just say, by way of clarification and apology, I know we were supposed to have a discussion day and an application, but it's just, it's first of all not that great medium to do on video. But more importantly, I'm just trying to get you the basics so you could get through the course okay, because there's so much else going on. So I do apologize if the discussion of Kant and Aristotle is a little less robust than if we were in class, but that's why. And it's not like I'm going anywhere. If you want to discuss these matters at a deeper level, look me up next semester, or we can talk about it in office hours, etc. I'm always happy to go as deeply as you want in any of these topics. Having said that, the goal today will be to get through just what you need to know for the final. And I could already tell you you'll need to explain one of these two arguments on the final. So, first of all, in terms of um, situating these, we talked about last class. The function argument is Aristotle's answer to the question, why should we be virtue ethicists? And so, thinking about that from that perspective, it should be trying to connect goodness with virtue in some way. And your construction of the argument needs to reflect that. Having said that, remember it's Aristotle. Aristotle's a scientist, he's the scientist, which means any type of argument is going to start with something we know, start with something we can observe. And so Aristotle says start with whatever you want. Start with something that we know can be good. So something that can be good or bad, and ask, when is it good? So this should be able to work for anything. Think of a pair of shoes. When are a pair of shoes good? Well, when they're affordable and stylish and comfortable and durable and protect your feet, roughly speaking. What do those all have in common? Uh, First of all, that's all part of fulfilling the function of a shoe. But we haven't quite said enough, because that's what makes it a shoe. That doesn't necessarily make it a good shoe. So think of the function of a meal as to nourish you. That doesn't mean I consider a big bowl of gruel, which is pretty much what I'm eating at this point due to the coronavirus outbreak. But I don't consider that good food, even though it nourishes me. And so we need to go beyond function into excelling at our function. And so the answer of when is anything good, it's when it performs its function excellently. Now, you might say, well, wait a minute. How does that have to do with virtue? Because remember what I told you, the word that gets translated into virtue is the Greek word arete, which actually means something more akin to personal excellence. And so excelling at one's function is actually is including the Aristotelian notion of virtue. And notice that's even preserved if you think in music, if you've ever heard of a virtuoso, is someone who excels at playing that instrument. So the function argument again, take something we know can be good or bad, ask when is it good? The answer is always going to be when it performs its function excellently. And so there we have an argument that's directly connecting goodness with arete, with excellence. So far, so good. But notice that does require something further, because theoretically, yes, this works fine for shoes and for meals, but nobody's interested in being an excellent shoe. I want to be an excellent human. And so we need to talk about what is the human excellence. And so to answer that, we would need to know the human function. Now, Aristotle doesn't get super clear on that in the Nicomachean Ethics, because he's assuming that his students already know this from a much earlier work called the Categories. In fact, the Categories was Aristotle's work that he basically said you have to do first. And so in the Categories, Aristotle tells us how to find functions. So let's do a side note. You always know how I like to put those in brackets on how to discover function. And what we're going to find is that for Aristotle, function is always tied to essence. What's essence? Great question. An essence is a philosophical term. It's going to sound a little silly, but not if you think about it. An essence is what makes a thing what it is. So ultimately what we're interested in is the human essence, which is what makes a human a human. But, we could talk about the essence of a hammer. What makes a hammer a hammer? Or what makes a shoe a shoe? Or what makes a horse a horse? That's whatever the answer is an essence. And it's the essence is actually about the thing. The essence of human is actually something that is in humans. It's not language. We're not doing linguistics here. We're doing philosophy, specifically ontology. So, how do we find an essence? Excellent question. Aristotle says that we can discover an essence. Again, it's discovered, not created. We can discover an essence by identifying two things. The genus and the differentia. So the genus is just what kind of thing is it? Think of it as one step up on a taxonomy. The differentia is what separates it from other things of the same kind. If you identify those two things, you have identified something's essence. Now, you might think, does that sound familiar? Identify two things in order to define something's essence? Yeah, we still use it in biology. It's called binomial nomenclature. Who was the father of biology? Oh yeah, Aristotle. But think about that for a second. This is something that's been helpful enough that it's actually lasted in science for over 2,000 years. Can you think of anything else that has actually proven useful to science for over 2,000 years? Not much. So there's definitely something to this. So we're going to practice a little. So go back to the hammer. If I want to know what makes a hammer, identify its genus and its differentia. What kind of thing is a hammer? It's a tool. That's the genus. So now we have to ask, what separates hammers from other tools? The answer, roughly speaking, is that it's used for pounding. So we could say the essence of a hammer is a tool used for pounding. And first of all, that seems about right. But notice we can talk about the essence of a hammer, or we can also talk about more specifics, like the essence of a tack hammer or a ball-peen hammer. Follow the same method. So we could really do it at any level of specificity. That's why when I say genus, I say one step up from wherever you are. Second thing to notice, though, is that Aristotle seems to be right in the sense that the essence tells us the function. By defining a hammer as a tool used for pounding, it tells me what the function of a hammer is, which means a good hammer is one that excels at its function, that is, excels at being used for pounding. So I have some good hammers and I have some bad hammers. Let's do another example. Suppose I say something like, well, what is the essence of professor? And I say, what kind of thing is a professor? And here's where we have to be careful why it's always important to go one step up. Because if I say, what kind of thing is a professor? And you say, oh, it's a human. And I say, okay, what separates a professor from other humans? Well, there are people who are employed as teachers in college. Wait a minute, I've just given 3 differentia. And so how do you know you've gone one step up instead of multiple steps up when there's one differential? So instead, if I say, what is a professor, go one step up and say a professor is a kind of teacher. That's one step up instead of 3. And I say, okay, what differentiates professors from other teachers? You'd say, well, collegiate level. So you might say the essence of a professor is to be a college level teacher. So notice that tells the function, and therefore, what makes a good professor? They have to excel at being a college level teacher. So that's the goal. All right. So our side note has taught us how to determine a function. We identify the essence. So what is the essence of a human? What kind of thing is a human? Aristotle gives different answers in his biology and his philosophy. In philosophy, he says humans are a kind of animal. Are humans animals? Sure. If you don't believe me, go ahead and never poop again. Of course, humans are animals. But the relevant philosophical question is what separates or distinguishes humans from other animals. And Aristotle says that we can think abstractly. Um, so rational in the Aristotelian sense. So the essence of human is to be a rational animal, or in the biology, a rational biped. And if you translate rational biped into Latin, you get Homo sapien. So the essence of human is to be a rational animal, rational biped, which means to be a good human is to excel at that. What does that mean? To excel at doing the kinds of things humans are supposed to do. Being rational in the sense of thinking abstractly. That includes things, the big thing that comes up a lot in the reading is what Aristotle talks about as rational deliberation. Humans are the kind of things that can plan in both the short term and the long term. And that's important. We can't only think of short term. We don't want to excel at being puppies. We want to excel at being humans. And so um, we can deliberate rationally, but what we're really doing in ethics is rationally deliberating about the good life. And as we learned last time, that means to see as our goal, our goal is the one basic or self-sufficient good, happiness. So to excel at being a human, if we put all these pieces together, is, well, it has to be in terms of virtue, has to include rationality, and has to include the pursuit of happiness. And so we might say that the human good is to cultivate the virtues conducive to the rational pursuit of happiness, if you wanted a bumper sticker. So cultivate the virtues conducive to the rational pursuit of happiness. First of all, that's why it's worthy of humans instead of pigs, because we're rationally pursuing happiness. We get the virtues in there because we're trying to be a certain kind of person. That's how we get to happiness, by being the right kind of person. And because it's rational, this includes things like taking facts about the world into account. If you're worried about Nagel's moral luck, for instance, it is simply not rational to ignore the consequences of your actions. And so let's pause here and say something about Kant versus Aristotle. So both say being human is really important to ethics, but notice they say it in a different way. Kant says what's important about being human in ethics is our ability to have intent to do right. That is, to intend the moral law. That's what makes a human for Kant, is that humans are ethical beings. However, Aristotle thinks of humans in a biological sense. Well, what is special about humans biologically? This ability to plan and think and reason abstractly. We have a frontal lobe that's very high functioning. And so for Aristotle, to be a human is to be a rational animal. And so both philosophers have to build their ethics around being human, but they isolate different parts of humanity. Do notice, and this is what I mean by the caveats on the review sheet, well, we need to be humans, which is a complete life. So humans are not just humans, they're animals. They're social animals. They're herd animals. which means we need to have excellences like being healthy, because that's just part of being a good animal, and being in some way caring about other humans, because that's just part of being a good social animal. He also says we're a political animal. Let's set that aside for the course. So, first of all, we need to be pursuing, cultivating the excellences conducive to happiness in a complete life. You know, so colloquially, you want to be a good friend and a good student, and those will come into conflict sometimes. So, which one's more important? That's something you have to figure out with rational deliberation. But also, we do need our minimal needs met. So, if I'm starving to death, I'm not living the good life according to Aristotle. And as weird as that might sound, there's also says something deeply right about it. So, just remember that humans are very complex beings in life and in Aristotle's philosophy. So that's the function argument, and then into what it means to be a good human, Aristotelian in a nutshell. But Aristotle's going to help us a lot more. So now we're going to kind of shift to how to be good humans. That is, how to be good Aristotelians, I should say. And this is the second. We need to talk some about virtues, because rational deliberation requires us to decide what kind of person we want to be, which involves identifying which virtues we should be cultivating and which ones are the most important, etc. So here's a few things to help with that in the second half of the Aristotle meeting. First of all, Aristotle says there's a couple of different kinds of virtues. There are intellectual virtues and moral virtues. Careful. As we were talking about in Kant, moral can just mean about action. So what's the difference between intellectual virtues and moral virtues? Nothing to do with ethical evaluation. Instead, it's just about how they're obtained and cultivated. Intellectual virtues are virtues that can be obtained and cultivated just by study. So I can be an excellent geographer just by sufficient study. By contrast, moral virtues, says Aristotle, are the ones that we can only obtain by practice, by acting. So, for instance, if I've read every book ever written on the art of playing the piano, does that make me a good piano player? Of course not, because being a good piano player is not an intellectual virtue, it's a moral virtue. And so we only acquire moral virtues by practice. Now, notice we can acquire vices by practice too. That's why, again, moral is just about how virtues are acquired, not about anything else. So that's thing one. So recognizing that some virtues we should be pursuing, we can do by study, the rest we need to do by practice. The second thing that's going to help us in figuring out what kind of person we need to be, and that is what virtues we should cultivate and which ones are more important, etc., is to answer a question about degree. And this is Aristotle's second big argument, that is the doctrine of the mean. Just like last one, since it's an Aristotelian argument, start with something we know. In this case, he's going to say, start with something we know can be a virtue, and then ask, when is it not a virtue? And so Aristotle uses a specific and very clear example, courage. Courage can be a virtue, but it's not always. So we might ask, when is courage not a virtue? And Aristotle's going to say the answer is always in two cases, cases of excess and deficiency. Too much courage, that is, if I'm acting too courageously, I'm foolhardy. That's not a virtue. It's not a virtue if you just walk into a room and try to pick a fight with the toughest person there. But too little virtue, and I'm a coward. And so the virtue lies in a mean between extremes. So, first of all, this is about virtues. This is about character traits, not about actions. I want to be courageous, but I don't want to be too courageous. And Aristotle's going to say this is true of all virtues. And sometimes it might be weird to think about, but, well, justice is a virtue, being just. Can I be too just? Yes, because if I'm too just, I don't forgive. And so I might have too much justice to me. And of course, I could have too little justice and be biased. Instead, justice must be cultivated as a virtue, as a mean between extremes. Now, here's the tricky part. And again, it's something that we can't really spend the whole day on like I would have otherwise. You might say, well, wait a minute. Justice still comes in a lot of degrees. It's not just too much, too little, and perfect. Instead, there's a whole range of degrees of justice between the extremes. And so, how do we figure that out? Aristotle says, well, of course, it's a rational mean rather than a numeric mean, which means here comes that rational deliberation again. This is the kind of thing we need to deliberate on. Just how just should I be? And so that's the doctrine of the mean. So putting this all together, just even starting Aristotle means we have to put this big focus on rationality and rational deliberation because that's what humans do and that's who humans are. And also, frankly, this is an important question. How do I obtain the good life? What kind of person should I be? Those are big questions, which means we really need to think carefully about it. It's not an answer that Aristotle can give you in a paragraph because we have to sit there and think about it, think about our external constraints, think about the world and react to the world. And so we really need to figure this out as kind of a personal journey with constant revision and constant contemplation and introspection. You can start to see the worry. A standard criticism of Aristotelian ethics is it's too hard in certain senses. Not everybody can do this level of rational deliberation that he seems to require. So this will be a good point to introduce the last two readings of the semester. Oh yeah, said that right. Last two readings of the semester, Maio and Frankena. Maio is a virtue ethicist. He's a contemporary virtue ethicist, and in some senses, if he's defending virtue ethics, he needs to defend it against the kinds of criticism that we might raise against Aristotle. So let me tell you what they are. There's a worry that the function argument doesn't work. Feel free to Google it, but I won't tell you why not just yet. Which means, remember what the function argument does. That's the sole reason why we should be virtue ethicists according to Aristotle. Which means, if the function argument doesn't work, we need a separate reason for being virtue ethicists. So Maio will give you a completely different reason, other than the function argument, for why we should be virtue ethicists. But then the second worry we just talked about is this notion that this sheer level of rational deliberation and introspection is just too much work. And so the second thing Maio is going to do, he's going to give you what you might call a shortcut and talk about, well, why is it such that, sorry, I know I'm sticking. I don't mean why, I mean how. Well, how might we be good Aristotelians, be good virtue ethicists, and avoid that sheer degree of investment? And so he's going to give us somewhat of a shortcut for rational deliberation. So that's the two things to watch for in Maio. An independent reason why we should be virtue ethicists, and a shortcut in terms of how we should be virtue ethicists to kind of cut down on the rational deliberation. Last reading of the semester will be Frankena. Frankena's article is a critique of virtue-based ethics. He's actually using critique correctly, which is rare. Critique usually means to identify a problem and suggest how to fix it. So he'll also have a dual thesis. He's going to identify a problem in virtue ethics. Hint, the problem he identifies goes directly against what Maio says. But then he's going to suggest how to fix it. And the way he suggests to fix it has to do with combining multiple approaches to ethics. So this is something that quite a few students have asked about throughout the semester. Well, are there ways to combine ethics? So it's kind of a nice way to end the semester on the Frankena, so watch for that as well. Otherwise, we will see you next time.